Ami's here, and today's video we're going to be talking about assessing vestibular discrimination skills. So let's get started. What are vestibular discrimination skills? It's basically the brain's ability to take in information from movement and gravity and be able to interpret it correctly. And so the way we want to assess it is by looking at the skills that develop as a result of being good at vestibular discrimination. So this is different from vestibular modulation, which is if you have a high threshold or a low threshold and how you react to movement, if you get dizzy or not dizzy. That is a separate vestibular assessment. And if you're interested in more information on that, I have videos looking at PRN and how to measure vestibular modulation, so you can check those out. But today we're really going to be talking about those skills, those discrimination skills. So let's start out with balance. Balance is one of the most common things that we assessed when we're looking at vestibular discrimination, and that's because the vestibular system has very close ties to our balance reactions. It helps us to interpret what's happening when we get thrown off a little bit so that we can make that adjustment. So you want to look at both static and dynamic balance. Static balance is just like what it sounds like. When you are still, how do you do? Can a child just sit in the chair and like not fall out of it? Well, good for them. That means that they have good static balance, and not everybody can do that. So bravo. You can also look at single leg stance. So standing on one leg, that's a very common balance test that we do to look at static balance. And when you're doing that with, like, for example, standing on one leg, you want to look and see how are their reactions to it? Are they able to move their ankle and make those little adjustments so that they're balancing properly? Or do they have to move their whole body and their arms and everything's moving in order to be able to stand on one foot? So that's the continuum of what we might look at when we're looking at static balance. And then for dynamic balance, we're going to be looking at, like, how do they do when they have movement? And that's when they're moving through space. So a lot of times I'll ask a parent, like, how's their balance? And they'll say, oh, their balance is great. You know, they can like climb up on all the playground equipment. They have no problem. They're great on their scooter, and, you know, like they're always just moving, and their balance is great. But then when you get them to try to do static balance, it's really poor. And that's because when they're moving, they're getting more vestibular input. So they're able to react better when they have additional feedback from the vestibular system. So we want to look at static versus dynamic. And dynamic balance is going to be like moving through the clinic. How are they doing with negotiating all of the equipment? How do they do if they're on like a push scooter, or can they ride a two-wheel bike if that's age appropriate? How is that movement while they're, how is that balance while they're moving? And how does that compare to static balance? And finally, how is their balance with their eyes open compared to their balance with their eyes closed? That's another thing that's really important to look at, because that tells us a little bit about how the vestibular and the visual systems are working together. So that's one skill that you look at when you're doing vestibular discrimination. Related to that, you also want to be looking at their equilibrium reactions and their writing reactions. You want to see if they're pushed off balance, are they able to like curve their body to keep their head upright? Because we should always want, the body automatically wants to move so that the head stays upright when the balance is perturbed. So this is easiest to do on like a therapy ball, or sometimes I'll have them on a glider swing or like a bucket swing that doesn't have a lot of support around them. And then I can just move the swing and see how they're reacting to it. You can also do it on a rocker board, and you can watch to see if they're making adjustments. So when you're on a rocker board and you're going back and forth, one knee is bending and then the weighted knee is locking in, and then you make that adjustment and the other knee locks and the unweighted knee bends. So that's a very common reaction when you're on a rocker board and moving. But sometimes with our kids with poor discrimination skills, you'll see them just lock their legs. They're just trying not to fall, or they've just bent both legs and they can't make that weight shift. You'll also see it play out when they're trying to climb stairs. Instead of doing an alternating foot pattern, they might have to do a step 2 pattern where they're putting 2 feet on each step because they're having a hard time with that kind of weight shift. So those are some different ways of looking at balance: static, dynamic, equilibrium, and writing reactions. Stay tuned for another video where we'll talk about additional skills that you want to look at when you're testing vestibular discrimination. Thanks, and see you next time.